This is our second to last Sunday through our journey through Mark. So we've already gone all your Mark, we've already gotten ready, and we're about to finish our go. However, I wanted to take this into perspective that way back in the day when we introduced this, I had mentioned that one of the views on Mark was that Mark had written this, John Mark, the guy who traveled with Peter, maybe traveled with Paul a little bit, wrote this gospel after Rome sacked the Jewish temple in 70 AD as an encouragement to tell Gentiles to not fall away. Because in Gentile authority, the top dog, the winner, how wars were fought is that if your side won, your God was stronger. And in the human mind, Rome, Israel fought, Rome won, Rome's God is stronger, and Mark is saying, no, he's not. Putting that into perspective, we have this guy writing a book, as well as telling the story of Jesus and telling the story of salvation, is letting these people know who use power and authority as their gauge of who to follow, that that's not always the case. And I did say, we're talking about Mark, we're going through Mark 15, but I had Ezekiel 1 read out, because in Mark 15, we have this official trial and crucifixion of Jesus. It is Christmas in July and Easter in August, okay? And Jesus is allowing his life to be determined, saved, or crucified by created beings, us. The people he created, he's saying, my life is in your hands. And Ezekiel helps us understand a given paradox. I'm going to simplify Ezekiel 1. That whole chapter is God riding in on a chariot. That is what that whole chapter. Ezekiel is just saying, hey, God is on a chariot coming in through the clouds, but it's so awe-inspiring and so awesome, there's no way to describe it. One of the ways, if you look at the context of the passage, there's these repeating motifs of 4 creatures pointing in every direction. These creatures have likeness of animals. These wheels are covered in eyes. There's a colloquial term in Hebrew that those eyes don't literally mean like the eyeballs that we have. It's their term for a bejeweled substance. They used eyes to describe jewels. And what Ezekiel is describing here is constellations and the cardinal directions. God's chariot are the beasts that are in the stars, those divine beings that Jeremiah taught us about, that the Jews believe in. God uses them as his chariot. The directions of the earth, north, south, east, and west, are the wheels upon which God rides. And the one who sits on the throne is scary and awe-inspiring to look at. That God stands before people and says, decide what happens to my life. Often we talk about how God is hidden in the quiet places. There's that famous story of the prophet sitting in the mountain and he sees the thunderstorm and the earthquake, and God's not in that. God's that still small voice that comes afterwards. But sometimes God is the star rider, the one who comes in through the clouds, whose voice is like many waters. And that God stands before men who get to decide his life. And so when we read Mark 15, we have this opportunity. Oftentimes Mark 15 or the crucifixion story in the other Gospels only is read through the lens of Easter. And so oftentimes it's read with that push of how do we describe Jesus' death and salvation that he offers to us. And I don't want to deny any of that. This is an Easter text. No wasting that premise. However, coming at it in the middle of the year, unexpectedly, we have this opportunity to also look at the nuances of the text, the nuances of the message that we might forget about or pass over for the thrust of the Easter message on Easter. And so the main idea I want us to take away from this whole text is that our jobs as created beings, as humanity, as the one that being saved, to match our expectations to God's. He does not have to match our expectations. We have to change our expectations because the very God who created everything is now kneeling before a ruler and having his life decided in a court case. And how we're going to get to that conversation about expectations is our map today. Step 1 is king versus king. Step 2 is revolutionary versus revolutionary. And step 3 is God versus God. So starting in Mark 15, verse 1, we're going to head straight into king versus king. And so this is after, our passage last week where Jesus was arrested. The premise is Jesus was arrested illegally. The Jewish court got a gang up in the middle of the night, went and effectively kidnapped Jesus, and that was illegal. They had no court power to do all that. And so starting in verse 1 of 15, and as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribe of the whole council, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. This was to legalize their abduction. They made it seem like, oh, we rounded up Jesus, but at the same time, let's meet in the morning and make it seem like we just arrested him. And then they go to Pilate, and Pilate asks Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? This whole conversation is king versus king. So let's pause and understand who Pilate is. He's this random character that just now gets brought up. But we need to understand some of the history in that Jesus time. So we know when Jesus was born, the Gospels tell us of this king called Herod the Great. He's the one that killed all the babies in Israel in an attempt to kill the Messiah. He died. Sometime after Jesus was born, he died. And he was the king of Israel, serving under the Roman Empire. But when he died, the Roman Empire said, we don't need another king. He had 4 children. So what Rome did is they divided Israel up into 5 districts. They divided Israel up into 5 districts, gave his children ownership effectively over 4 of the districts, not as kings, just as governors and officials, and then kept one to themselves, Judea and Jerusalem. And so Pilate was the Roman face of Judea and Jerusalem, and effectively the highest governmental elite in all of Israel. He was the de facto king of Israel at this time. This Roman input was the person who made all the decisions in collaboration with the Jewish temple and Rome back way away. But effectively, he was Caesar's. We've used the word idol as representative. He was Caesar's idol in Israel. Because of that, I really, in my mind, when I read this passage, I think of him as king. And so Jesus answers that operative king when Pilate asks him, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus says, you have said so. And then the chief priests accuse Jesus of many things. And Pilate, again, this de facto king, again asks him, have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you. But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. I mentioned at the beginning that the foundation of Roman, I use Gentile, but the foundation of Roman power and authority, their idea of kingship, their idea of rulership, who's whoever wins. So someone who is king would never let themselves be defiled like this. They would never let themselves be abducted without a fight. They would never stand before another king without some sort of arrogance and dignity. So how is this Jesus, this person who's being accused of claiming to be king, just kneeling there, not defending himself? It goes against the Roman idea of authority. Even Jesus' answer puzzles Pilate, because in the Greek, it's super simple. It's just suleges, and it just means you say. You are saying, if we want to translate it hyper-literally. So when Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus says, you are saying. This passage doesn't give a lot of context in English what that really means. There's a few real ways that we can take this. It could be really dismissive and saying like, oh, you're just saying that, stop, right? It could be accusative as it's saying, you're saying that, but I'm not. It could be validating. Well, you said it, and that's true. The gig is up. But in this idea of the king and the star rider, the cloud gatherer, the one who creates, kneeling before a man who has this idea of what authority and privilege and kingship looks like, is just saying, you say that because I don't think you understand what being a king means. It's this idea that if I'm claiming to be a king, why would I let myself be treated this way? If I'm claiming to be ruler, why would I be kneeling before you? Jesus is effectively telling Pilate that he has to match his expectations to God's. Pilate expects this grand royal entry, and instead he has a man in rags that's been abducted. If we skip forward a little bit into Mark 15:16, we get a little bit of this conversation happening after Jesus' condemnation, and elaborates on this confusion of expectations even more. So after Jesus' public sentencing, the soldiers led him away inside to the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, the de facto palace. They use the word palace. It's like, this is where the king dwells. And they called together the whole battalion, and they put on him a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple robe and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. The person that in hindsight we declare king, his coronation was humiliation. That was too rhymey, and I apologize. The Greeks and Romans here understood in accident Jesus' royalty more than Pilate did, more than the Jewish elite did. They kneeled down before him, gave him a crown, put a cloak on him. Even if it was to insult him and humiliate him, it was better royal treatment than Jesus had gotten in a few days. They were the only ones that recognized and actually paid the words that Jesus deserved, even if their actions were humiliating. The King of Kings donned his crown among mockers and pain. And unlike a Roman king who'd be arrogant and egotistical and not stand for this treatment, the king that we worship is a king that lowered himself beyond our understanding to the ground, such that his praise was mockery, his adornment was torture. In all honesty, this is how we treated kings that we rebel against. You think of the French Revolution. Everyone rose up against the royal class and killed them all. And in some way, that's humanity's history from the very beginning, is raise up against the ones in power and let's get rid of them. All the way from the fallen creation, where Adam and Eve, even though in their mind it was just innocent, potentially, or in their mind it was actively rebellious, they just thought, oh, God, did God actually tell me not to eat this? Am I actually going to die? Here we have the same thing, where these Roman soldiers are like, oh, nothing's going to happen. I'm just humiliating this guy who made these outlandish claims. But we have to match our expectations to God's, because his version of the king is not the one we would expect. His version of the king is not the one who demands your praise. He asks for it. His version of the king is not the one who sits there and as Philippians 1 tells us, Philippians 2, as Philippians tells us, grasps for power like it's something that he needs, but he'd rather lay it down and have it given to him. He's not the king we expect, but he is our king. Neither does God fulfill our expectations of what revolution and change or a revolutionary looks like. As we move on to our next step, Mark 15:6. So we're going to be skipping around Mark just a little bit, but it works out. Mark 15:6 brings us back to Jesus' trial, saying, "Now at the feast, Pilate used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And Pilate answered them, saying, 'Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?' For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have him release Barabbas instead." Just like we had to understand a little bit about Pilate, now let's understand a little bit about Barabbas, because there's a literary device going on here. Because Barabbas comes from the words Bar and Abba, meaning son of the Father. And when we read that in English, it's really easy to pick up, oh, Jesus is the Son of the Father. And then we have Barabbas, who's the Son of the Father. Mark is doing something here. In fact, there's some documents that, depending on how much you trust them, that actually show that Barabbas' first name was Jesus. So he was Jesus Barabbas, Jesus, son of the Father. Debatable, but if it's true, it just adds to the depth of this literary device that Mark is using. But his origin is simple according to the Gospels. He's a revolutionary. Some people decided to rise up against Rome, and through violence and murder and mayhem, say, Rome, get out of here. They lost. Barabbas is arrested. He's put in prison. Hence, this story wouldn't work. But his idea of a revolution was, let's kill the people in power. Let's murder everyone around. Let's claim and steal back that which is ours. He is humanity searching for power. For those taking notes, as you read this story, I'm not going to get into it in detail today, but write down Leviticus 16. Go read it on your own. There's an interesting parallel with what's happening here. It gets talked about in Easter, but I think it also helps us all to go read that. Continuing on in Mark, and then Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man that you call the King of the Jews?" And they cried out, "Crucify him." "We want Barabbas, crucify Jesus." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. In this story, Barabbas represents violent revolution, but his revolution ended with prison. Jesus represented true revolution through love and service and character change and this divine salvation that God offers us. Barabbas offered death. Jesus offers life. Barabbas was a threat to the ruling class, while Jesus showed no such opposition. The chief priest's envy and Pilate's urge to appease the people led him to free the threat and condemn the remedy. Pilate here was actually falling into, Basically, he was politically weak. When Pilate took ownership over Judea and Jerusalem, he stole a bunch of money from the temple to make some city improvements. And ever since that time, him and the religious elite never got along. And so we have this weird collaboration here in this story where, the scribes and the Pharisees are coming to Pilate saying, "We want this." And typically that wouldn't happen, but Pilate's saying, "Oh, here's an opportunity for me to build relationship with the people that I govern over." And that's exactly what happened here in Barabbas. Pilate wanting to appease the people, release Barabbas. It wasn't the crowd out there. It was literally Pilate coming in and saying, "Hey, I have an opportunity to get a leg up with these people, so they'll actually listen to me. I'm going to condemn this non-criminal and free this real criminal." But instead, a false revolutionary was freed instead of the true revolutionary. Pilate gave up this opportunity of peace and instead released a person who actually insurrected against Rome. Instead of Jesus who said, "Pay taxes." We must match our expectations to God. Because God, in that regard, in that opportunity, in that Jesus saying, "Hey, pay taxes to Rome," is still offering true revolution. It's just instead of murdering people, he's saying, revolute? He's saying create revolution by changing yourself first, not changing the people around you. In Mark 15:21, this continues, the revolution motif is continued after Jesus' flogging and torture. And so they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. On a quick note, something about Jesus' punishment that we need to take into consideration is that it was kind of out of order. Typically, flogging is actually done after the person's mounted on the cross. And so when Jesus gets flogged and then has to, in some of the other Gospels, literally carry his cross, the reason Simon was taken up to help him is because Jesus likely could not. And we recognize that. But that typically wasn't the case. The person being executed would carry their cross, but instead Jesus was beat beforehand. And then they expected him to do it. Something was out of order. And so Jesus' torture here was a lot more than any standard Roman execution on the cross happened. This is even taken to a certain extent by that wine mixed with myrrh was a painkiller. They wanted him to be able to do it, so they gave him wine mixed with myrrh to literally numb him down so just that he could, and so that he would live longer in that pain. And Jesus rejected it. I don't know why Jesus rejected it, but he did. I have speculations. I don't know why a man in Jesus' state would reject a little painkiller, but I'm also not Jesus. Continue on in Mark. I don't know what verse this is, Julia. It's just the next verse in the series. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each would take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him, and the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." Right above him, big placard, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads, saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him one another, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." And those who were crucified alongside him also reviled him. Just as Jesus was charged alongside Barabbas and condemned alongside Barabbas, who was freed, Jesus was crucified as a criminal amongst criminals. The man who never once did a violent act, the man who healed the servant after his ear was cut off, the man who said, "Pay taxes to Rome." The most criminal thing that we might be able to justify Jesus did was picking grain on the Sabbath. And he gave a really good answer for why that was okay. The man who was the most anti-criminal thing out there was crucified as a criminal among criminals. And though he preached improved character and service and sacrifice and love, and though he preached fulfillment of the 10 Commandments, the fulfillment of the Jewish law, he was reviled and hated and mistreated. His words were turned against him and presented as a cause for upheaval and rebellion. This man, this Jesus, pegged to a cross, the King of Israel, our star rider, our creator, the man whose presence is precedented by thunder and lightning and fire beyond our comprehension. The man who offers true change and true evolution died in this moment, or is dying in this moment. And the people here, and likely us if we were in the same situation, missed it. Because we expected change to come out as loud and gallant and very noticeable. But Jesus came in, the creator, the big guy, the dawn of the world, the universe, came in as a small, lowly creature, offered revolution, but not in the violent way Barabbas did. For we must match our expectations to God's. The Jews expected Jesus to come in as this loud, gallivant creature. But God expected Jesus to come in as just somebody who wanted relationship and friendship with you. And then we get to the final part of our map. God versus God. Continuing in Mark 15:33. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, I'm not going to pronounce this right. All of my Greek teaching was, foreign language teaching for this was all written. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, Behold, he is calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come down and to take him. And then Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. Just as I had mentioned that Jesus' punishment was kind of done in reverse, because of that, a crucifixion could last days. Person being pierced on the cross, your body can go 3 or 4 days without water. And so when you're up there, the only real damage to your body is being in that cross position and the puncturing of your hands and feet. So you are bleeding and you're going through trauma, but in reality, your punishment is very mild. The punishment is the crucifixion. And so you're up there dying of dehydration, dying of you're dying because you can't breathe. You're dying of hunger. Blood loss is one of the lower parts of how you die on the cross. So Jesus dying within a few hours was anomalous. Him coming up there and just dying within 5 or 6 hours, they were all surprised about it. I suspect partially it's because of his mistreatment prior to being crucified, partially because of the divine nature of this punishment. Continuing on in Mark, and upon Jesus' death, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Many miraculous and supernatural events did surround Jesus' death. When we put all the Gospels together, we have an eclipse. We have various spirits coming up and visiting people, coming from the dead. We have an earthquake. And we have this super thick dividing curtain of the temple that was designed to separate people from the presence of God being ripped in half, top to bottom. And this Roman guard watching Jesus took these events, at least the ones he could probably see. I suspect he didn't see the temple ripping, but he saw the earthquake and the eclipse and these loud divine events. And he recognized Jesus as the Son of God. Now, again, as Christians, this is one of the parts where we can accidentally read hindsight into the Bible. When this centurion was saying, "Oh, surely he's the Son of God," do not take this as him recognizing Jesus the Son of Yahweh, Jesus the Son of the dawn. He was likely just saying, "Oh wow, this guy was a demigod. He was the son of a divine being. He had some truth to his claim. He is the Son of God." Now, from our cultural perspective, knowing that who Jesus is and who he's the son of, we read in that top dogness into this nature. However, this Roman soldier just expected, wow. We have people like Hercules, these demigods, and he was just recognizing Jesus as one of those. A literal son of a god. And what I'm saying is his revelation was short-sighted. Because now we do recognize that Jesus was the Son of the God, the big guy, the star rider, the creator, the dawn of the universe. I'm going to repeat those because that's just the paradox we're sitting in. Who would expect that the one who rides the constellations would die a criminal's death? Not this Roman guard, not Pilate, not the Jewish elite. Who would dream that the creator would fall into the hands of creation willingly? But that God did exactly that. That God put himself into the palm of our hands to decide his fate. That God did not do what we would expect a God to do. He did not vie for power. He did not create a revolution that murdered people. He did not try to stand up for himself in front of a human king. Instead, he allowed the process to pan out for the benefit of us. And so our expectations must change to match God's. Because obviously God didn't sit there and try to match ours. Jesus was this highest king, and yet he allowed himself to be forced to prostrate before a human king. Jesus was the true revolutionary, but he was exchanged for a false one. And while Jesus was recognized as some sort of divine, the scope of that recognition was so, I wrote insignificant, but now that I'm writing it, insignificance is an insignificant word. The scope was not enough. That Roman soldier did not understand. It was misunderstood. And every situation had expectations of how a god, a king, a revolutionary should behave. And Jesus did the exact opposite. He wasn't meeting them. And despite all that, he is still God. He is still the star rider. He is still the creator. He is still the one whose messages are precedented by thunder and lightning. And despite being forced to kneel, and despite being rejected, and despite being tortured, and despite being misunderstood, he is still the highest of highest. He is still God, always was, and always will be. And so when this comes in the story, it's the recognition that we would likely do the same thing to Jesus. We are all people. We would stand before Jesus and say, crucify him. We would stand there in Pilate and be confused as to why this supposed king is kneeling. We'd be the ones calling out for Barabbas because Jesus did not come and meet our expectations. And when I put those two places together, that means it's our expectations that need to change. Sometimes God does come in, like in Ezekiel 1, in his chariot, and is holy and 100% recognizable as the authority that he is. Sometimes he comes in as a whisper behind the storm, something you have to try and listen for. Sometimes he comes in a dream, like with Gideon, where Gideon had to test to see if this was actually God he was talking to. And sometimes God comes in as an unsuspecting man. And whatever our expectations, we need to change them to match his plan, not the other way around. To finish off our story in Mark 15, this is coming from verse 42. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who also himself was looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have died already. Again, remember, crucifixion took days. Jesus died within hours. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. Joseph is an interesting character in this story because we have two elements that he does. He's looking for the kingdom of God, yet he accepted that Jesus has died. I don't actually know what was going through Joseph's mind in that moment. However, there was something about Jesus that was so valuable to him that when Jesus died, he didn't just reject him. In that moment, it'd be super easy to say, I had high hopes for this man and now he's dead. I just placed my hopes in the wrong Savior and I'm going to go find my next one. But something about Joseph kept value in Jesus. He represents an aspect of how I think we should behave, despite seeing how Jesus failed from a human perspective, at least. He still revered Jesus enough to care about his body, to focus on him. Those unmet expectations were cast aside to see this man he loved buried properly. Joseph gave Jesus dedication. He may not have believed in Jesus' resurrection yet, but he did value him. When we walk around and we have these moments where we either pray to God or we have these moments where, we think God should do something and he doesn't, where we feel like, I think one of the biggest things is probably here is that when we pray to God and we get silence, or maybe we feel this big fat no. And from a human perspective, from my perspective, it's really easy to just be like, oh, God doesn't love me. God doesn't care about me. God, are you actually there? This idea that I'm presenting out of this story is that sometimes it's not God doing anything wrong. It's just me. It's just you. And our humanity comes up and we have to match our expectations to what God desires and what God is putting forth, not the other way around. This is the conclusion of a conversation that happens in theology a lot, is this idea of this big question of why does God do things the way he does things? And there's this very dismissive answer, is because he's God and because he can. I think that dismisses the human opinion to doubt. And it's wrong to just have that be your answer. I don't know why God does some things. However, part of my salvation and part of my turning to Jesus is this idea of like, you know what? God is God and he can. And there's an element to me that has to be okay with that. I have to allow my expectations to meet God. To match God's. That's a better way to phrase that. I have reached the end of my text, though I do not feel like my conclusion was satisfactory. So before I ramble, I'm going to pray us out. Do you want to come up and sing another song, or do you want to just close? Okay, I'm going to pray us out, and we can have a glorious Sunday. Jesus, we have sat down and we have learned of your life. We have learned of your betrayal. We have learned of your death, and we are hopeful towards your resurrection. For we know that your story represents our salvation and our opportunity to grow in the path that God has planned for us. In the moments where we doubt you, in the moments where trust is hard to come by, I pray that you would help us mold our hearts to you. When we have unanswered or negative answered prayers, when things don't seem to go according to the promises that you've given us, when times are hard, when we feel betrayed, let us not fall away. Let us understand that your definition of success, your definition of sustenance, your definition of blessing may not all the time match ours. Help us humble our ego and help us be open to your authority and your power, so we don't fall away, we don't revile you, and we don't miss out on the salvation you have for us. God, you are a good God, even if sometimes my expectations do not accurately represent you. Help keep our hearts humble. I pray this over us in Jesus' name. Amen.